At Team Telomere, we are grateful to have an incredible team that prioritizes understanding not only the scientific aspects of TBDs, but also the psychosocial challenges and needs of those in the TBD community. We are thrilled to be joined by many members of the National Cancer Institute Psychosocial team here at camp, and today we will hear from a special psychosocial presentation from Ms. Emily Pearce and Cat Wilsnack. Okay, back there. Ms. Pearce is a current doctoral candidate at the University of North Carolina and is part of the NIH Graduate Partnership Program. For her doctoral research, she is studying expertise in management of medical uncertainty through the use of social media of TBD patients. She will kick off the presentation by presenting this work, and then Ms. Wilsnack is a current doctoral student at the University of Texas at Austin. She is also practicing licensed master social worker and an experienced psychosocial researcher. She was instrumental in setting up the TBD needs assessment study and will continue the presentation by sharing results from the study. So thank you both.
Thank you, Kelly. Good morning, everybody. So whose head is spinning right now? Yeah, just had a lot of information thrown your way. As you know, there are a lot of different parts and pieces to trying to help people with rare disease. Some of it is the science, and some of it is acknowledging that when the science doesn't move fast enough, you still have to live with it. And how can you live your best life with uncertainty? And so that's something I've been studying for my dissertation, and I'm going to share with you some work about how we might use social media for managing uncertainty in DC and other telomere biology disorders. So I want to start out just by talking about what uncertainty is. And so we think about it as this interruption of our normality when something new or unfamiliar happens. And in the psychosocial lingo, we call it kind of a metacognitive awareness of our own ignorance. And what that means is we know we don't know something, and it bothers us. And all of us have this experience at some point in our lives where we know something is amiss and not what we were expecting. But sometimes this can actually become kind of a public health problem, because even though uncertainty can lead us to hope, it can also lead us to some other mental states that can be more damaging to us, like depression, anxiety, stress, or difficulty with decision making. So we know with TBDs, they have all of these facets that make them unpredictable. They're rare, they're complex. They affect multiple organ systems. They have different ages of onset, different genetic variants, and different kinds of phenotypes, different ways they present clinically. So unfortunately, we can't prevent the uncertainty. But we can learn to understand it, and we can find ways to manage it. So one of the ways we can start to unpack a big concept like uncertainty is by breaking it down into its little pieces. And I worked with a professor named Paul Hahn, who thought up a taxonomy of medical uncertainty, which is a way to break it down. Now, I will share that my father thinks it's totally crazy that someone spent their entire life coming up with a way to think about uncertainty. But I'm going to show you why it's useful. So the way he thinks about uncertainty is that it has a few different sources, and that this can bring it into different issues of your life. So uncertainty comes from ambiguity, things that kind of mean something that's different. Complexity, where it's just really hard to understand something. Or probability, where you're wondering, like, what's the outcome going to be? And you just can't figure it out. And all of these sources of uncertainty come together, and they can affect things like the science. They can affect things in your personal life. And they can affect your practical ability to get things done. And so when we think about it that way, we know that people have different ways that they manage feeling uncertain. One way is to have that feeling that you're ignorant about something and go out and learn about it. So you fill your knowledge gaps by finding stuff out. Another way is to get those binders together and organize all your appointments, organize all the information, organize the genes, organize the symptoms. Try to reduce that chaos. Another thing you can do is to recognize that you're feeling stressed out about this. You need to relax. And so you do self-care, you do the yoga, you do those things that are going to help calm your response. And then the last thing, which is kind of what we're doing today, is that you find community. You find other people who can carry that feeling of uncertainty with you. So when you think about a rare disease, like TBDs, like DC, people are usually spread out all over the world. And so we thought, well, how are people managing uncertainty when they can't find people who are experiencing the same thing as them nearby? And that's where we got the idea of, what about social media? What about the internet? And so for this study, what we did was we partnered with Team Telomere, and we looked at 3 different types of social media that Team Telomere has. The first is a Facebook community group that was started during COVID to try to promote community connection. The second is their Facebook main page, and the last one is their Twitter account. And so what we did was, by hand, we selected posts over a 2-year period from each of these accounts till we got 2,860 posts. We put them into a database and assigned them different variables, and we also captured the images associated with them and all those cute little emojis that people use when they make posts. So after we took all the data, we quality controlled it, checked to make sure we didn't have any mistakes, and then we developed this code book because we wanted to know, going back to those pieces of that taxonomy, what parts of uncertainty are people talking about? Is it the scientific part? Is it the parts that's affecting their personal life? Does it have to do with the practicalities? What are they worried about, and how are people managing it? So we looked at that, we looked at frequencies, and we looked at themes. And that's all called a combined content analysis. I didn't do this alone. I say we for a reason. I'm part of a coding team. I'm part of a broader team. You're going to meet lots of IT members today. But one reason I wanted to bring this up that's particularly important is that sometimes when we have different life backgrounds and we look at data, we see different things from other people. And so if you have a bunch of researchers who all are the same in their upbringing or their outlook or their experiences, sometimes they're going to miss things in the data that somebody else would have seen. So we were lucky to have a bunch of different people on the coding team who had different eyes, different experiences to look at the data. So one thing we noticed right away was that there's a big difference between those different platforms I talked about in terms of who's participating. So probably this will be unsurprising for you guys, but the Facebook community group, that was the community. And of the community, it was mostly women, white women, who were parents of people who were affected. When we look at the main page, we see a mix of community members and also Team Telomere itself speaking out to the community. And on Twitter, it's mostly the voice of the organization, Team Telomere speaking out. So what did we find? This is a word cloud, which is just a count of all the different words that came out of that social media. The biggest word, the biggest, most talked about word is the word telomere. So what we found was that mostly people were focused on the science, the uncertainty of the science, and wanting to know things like, how did you get your diagnosis? Is this the right diagnosis? What's the prognosis? What therapies are there? What caused this? And so learning about telomere biology disorders and trying to figure out what it means with the science was really important. The next thing was practical. And so it was questions about access to care. It was questions about managing geography, coordinating care, the competency of care providers, scientific literacy, numeracy, access to research, and access to community networks. Now, we did see some investigation of personal issues with uncertainty. So identity, having a rare identity, what does that mean for how you change how you think about yourself and how you change where you think about belonging? Goals and expectations, how does it change what you're thinking about your career, about your education? Or morality, how does it change what you think about the value of a human being, the value of a human life? And then we also, of course, saw for management lots of trying to gain information, lots of trying to address that feeling of ignorance. Sharing information, seeking information, participating in research, disseminating research. And we saw a lot of ordering advice from people. How do you manage your appointments? How do you keep track of all the things that you need to know? How do we order on our website families so that families can find one another? So there's the ordering element. And then the response focus, dealing with that stress. There are messages of empowerment. There's messages of celebration. There's new celebrations that other people may not celebrate, like transplant anniversaries that become an important part of meaning. And then there's also relaxation being promoted through yoga and mindfulness. And of course, social media itself is a community-based management strategy. You're reaching out to find other people. You're community building. And you're also giving a really clear message that you're not abandoned here. There are other people out there who are thinking about things like you're thinking about things and who want to know the same things that you want to know. So with that said, you can see social media is doing a lot in terms of helping manage uncertainty. But there are some limitations I want to talk about. So when we looked at sentiment, the emotion, the emojis, what we found was overwhelmingly the posts are love, like, care. They're joking. They're celebratory. Science is really celebratory. When you see genes or petri dishes in these texts, it's a sign of something really good about to happen, right? But we don't see people talking about their harder feelings, the anger, the feeling tired, the confusion, the frustration, and the sadness. That's not so much there on social media. When we looked at it depending on who the voices were, we also found some interesting things, which is in the community, people are talking about the science questions. They're talking about the organizing questions, the practical questions, the probability, prognosis, therapy. And when you talk about those personal issues that I mentioned, what's going on in your heart about this and how it's impacting you mentally, that's mostly being talked about by Team Telomere. And they're inviting that thought, they're inviting that conversation, but that's not happening in the community group. And similarly with the discussion about stress responses, ways to relax, that's coming from Team Telomere out right now. We also noticed that while there's a ton of social support available on social media, most of it are offers for support. So you get altruistic people who want to help other people going on there and saying, hey, let me support you. You don't get so much people coming on and saying, hey, I need support. And that's an interesting thing to notice. So overall, we saw tons of uncertainty sources, issues, management strategies, social support happening on social media. But we saw some limitations. The exchanges are really brief. It's mostly offers of support. It's mostly focused on conversations about managing the science uncertainty or the practical uncertainty. And the sentiment is usually really positive. And it's mostly moms. So we had some questions, and we want to kind of keep looking at this about who's missing from these conversations online and why. Does social media actually increase uncertainty? Does it decrease uncertainty? What are the most effective strategies happening on social media? What are the relationship dynamics? What's the trade-off between your privacy and the researcher's ability to come in and see what's going on in your community? And how does this all change over time? So that is the end of my presentation. I'd just like to acknowledge all of the many mentors and friends who supported me in this at UNC Chapel Hill and also at the National Cancer Institute and at Team Telomere. And I similarly have the same QR codes you've just seen in case you want to take a picture of them again. But I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
Hi everyone, Kelly gave me a really nice introduction. Sorry I wasn't already up here, so you could put a face to the name, but my name's Catherine Wilsnack. You can also call me Kat. I see some familiar faces from the gala back in 2019 where I met a few of you, especially over the caregiver breakfast, which was really lovely. And I'm really excited to talk to you about one of the studies that has been mentioned several times this morning. And I know we're going to be pressing up on some lunchtime, and I don't want to interfere with anyone's food schedule, so I will go as quick as I can. Ignore the international meeting, I just forgot to change that. But as it's been mentioned many times, the DC TB needs assessment was something that was in the works. And currently I'm a doctoral student in social work at the University of Texas in Austin, but I'm still involved on these projects at the National Cancer Institute, this being one of them. And I'm going to talk to you more about the psychosocial needs of individuals and families living with telomere biology disorders and go into how it's a mixed method study. So this is our study team, just so you can put some faces and names. As you've seen, Emily, Ashley, Cam is in the back, and Sharon, and Dr. Savage. Okay, and as Sharon mentioned, these are just some study goals that our protocol is housed under in the inherited bone marrow failure syndrome studies at the NCI. And what our study aimed to do was to investigate more about how we can better take care of individuals and families living with TBDs. And part of that includes knowing what needs there even are. And so, as we've heard a lot this morning too, there's lots of medical complexity and ambiguity, uncertainty, and TBD and disease progression, which led us to think, how does this contribute to the multifaceted, unmet psychosocial needs of individuals and families living with TBDs? And currently, there is no psychosocial literature looking at this. So our study, the purpose of it was to conduct a needs assessment that identifies and describes the unmet needs of individuals and caregivers affected by TBDs. And I'll go a little bit into our methods, just so you have a little bit more of a background. But we used a participatory research design, which means that we worked with Team Telomere at a lot of the process of developing the study, from design to data collection, and now we're more in the analysis phase. But in order to participate, and I'm sure maybe some of you have seen it in the newsletter, have participated, but we did collect data on individuals who were bereaved, but we're still collecting data on that part of the study, so we wanted to just present more on the individuals and caregivers of what we have so far. So to participate, you had to be diagnosed with a TBD or a caregiver to someone with a TBD and be at least 18 years old. For the quantitative portion of the study, it was an online survey that I'll talk a little bit more about. And for this part, we asked individuals to identify from the perspective of one, knowing that people in this community can be a caregiver and an individual diagnosed with TBD. So when you go into the survey, it will ask you to complete from one perspective, either a caregiver, individual, or a bereaved individual. And the qualitative portion, as Emily alluded to, we had telephone interviews using an in-depth, semi-structured interview guide, and we learned so much and are still learning so much just from the wealth of everything that we've been able to collect in those interviews. And then this is just more about how we are going into analysis, how we are using the online survey results, and analyzing it along with the qualitative data that we're getting, and that's what I will be talking to you more about. But before the needs assessment for the online portion, this is the scale that we use. It's a needs assessment family cancer caregiver, and it covers the 4 domains, which is what the results will be organized so you can follow along more clearly. But some of this assessment assesses unmet needs related to psychosocial, medical, financial, and daily unmet needs. And survey respondents rated their reported needs according to the perceived level of importance and level of satisfaction. So what this looked like was you could select a need that you felt like you experienced, and they would ask you to rate how important was this. Was it not at all important, being 1 all the way to 5? This need is extremely important to me. Then it asks you to rate the satisfaction of fulfilling that need. This need is not at all important and not at all satisfied. This need is extremely important and not at all satisfied, just so you get some more of the language. And then our qualitative component, our interview guide and some of our analyses complemented this needs assessment by looking more at these domains in depth. So we looked at emotional, physical, social needs, resources as a means of finances, time, information, experiences with healthcare systems, and coping with TBDs. Which leads us to the results. And as I mentioned, we organize the results based on these 4 domains: psychosocial unmet needs, medical unmet needs, financial unmet needs, and daily unmet needs. And what I will do, I'm going to present one survey item from each of these domains paired with one of our qualitative findings. And if at any point anyone has questions, feel free to jump in or raise your hand. So this is some of the demographics that we got from the online survey. As you can see, there were 21 individuals diagnosed with TBD who filled it out from that perspective, and 15 who filled it out from the caregiver perspective. It was mostly female, mostly white, highly educated, very insured, or more educated, I should say. And the average age was 43 years old with a range of 26 to 69 years old. So for psychosocial unmet needs, there were 6 questions on this assessment that assessed for unmet needs related to distress and coping. And as you can see, all 21 of the individuals with TBD identified at least one unmet need in this section, and 12 of 15 caregivers identified at least one unmet need in this section. And so this was the survey item that we'll be looking at that both individuals and caregivers responded to, dealing with emotional distress such as anger, anxiety, depression, fear, resentment. And here on the graph, as you can see, we just put patients here to denote individuals diagnosed with TBD from caregivers. So if I use that language interchangeably, just so you know. On the y-axis here, we have our average rating, and I'll walk through this some more, but down here I also put some of the language to remember, and these numbers are rounded to the whole number, to the nearest whole number. So individuals and patients, 18 of the 21 individuals answered this specific survey item, and 11 of the 15 caregivers answered this specific survey item. So that's what these numbers are down here. So for patients, they rated this item, dealing with emotional distress, as quite a bit important, with it only being somewhat satisfying on average. And for caregivers, very similarly, quite a bit important, with it only being a little bit satisfying. Does that layout make sense? Are there any questions that I can clarify, just so moving forward it's easy to understand? We're good? Okay. And so we had an individual who's diagnosed with TBD, and she is also a caregiver to her daughter who has TBD, and she talked about how I can go in my bedroom or my bathroom and I can cry on my own. Through my therapist, she said you have to show emotion sometimes, and I've kind of closed that all off because I don't want to do that all the time. I'm afraid if I open that up, I might not be able to close it. So in our interviews is where we're able to see some of these survey items come more to life and give us more detail about how individuals and caregivers are experiencing emotional distress and the psychological burden. For medical unmet needs, there were 7 questions on the survey that assessed for unmet needs related to care, access, and health information. And again, we had 19 of the 21 individuals identify at least one unmet need, and 13 of the 15 caregivers identify at least one unmet need. And this was a survey item. As you can see, it varies just a little bit based on the language, but individuals rated the item getting the best possible care for yourself, and caregivers rated the item getting the best possible care for him, her, that being their loved one. And individuals on average rated this item as quite a bit important, but it only being somewhat satisfying. And caregivers the same, quite a bit important, getting the best possible care for their loved one and only somewhat satisfying. And so we had an individual talk about her experience, saying, my experience with a dermatologist was interesting because they had scheduled me a 15-minute appointment for a whole body screening, and their response was, you're too healthy for cancer. I was like, no, you don't understand. I have this diagnosis that makes me very susceptible, and they're like, yeah, we're all susceptible. I didn't put this quote on here because I think it's the best possible care. Clearly it's not. It's a very invalidating healthcare encounter, and it's a very, very common theme that we notice among interview participants, and how common of an experience this was. And I think it goes back to a little bit of what Abby was talking about this morning with this variable diagnostic odyssey, and how there's so many barriers to not only getting a diagnosis, but even once you do have a diagnosis, it doesn't guarantee that you automatically are going to get the best care possible, or the clinicians who are going to be most familiar and equipped to handle your diagnosis. For financial unmet needs, there were 3 questions that assessed for unmet needs related to expenses, medical costs, and insurance. So we had 11 of the 21 individuals identify at least one unmet need, and 11 of the 15 caregivers identify at least one unmet need. And the survey item I'll talk about is taking care of bills. And this is where we saw some individuals and caregivers differ a bit more in their rating and their average ratings. So individuals on average rated this as quite a bit important, only somewhat satisfied and meeting this need, whereas caregivers rated this on average extremely important, with it only being a little bit satisfying. So we had a mother who has 2 children diagnosed with a TBD talk about how it took off probably 6 months before his transplant, and then after transplant it was impossible to go back to work because we're in the hospital for 30 days and then we're going back and forth for 6 months. So this allowed us to see how individuals and caregivers may be experiencing financial unmet needs differently, especially when we consider caregivers who not only have one loved one with a TBD, but multiple that they're responsible for. And also the the financial burden of that and the barriers to being able to financially meet their needs. And so lastly, we have our daily unmet needs, and what this part of the survey looked at. There were 6 questions that assessed for unmet needs related to activities of daily living, work, school, and relationships. So 17 of 21 individuals identified at least one unmet need here, and 13 of 15 caregivers identified at least one unmet need. And the survey item was meeting your personal needs. And again, this is where we saw individuals and caregivers differ a bit. Now, individuals on average rated it quite a bit important to meet their personal needs, with it only somewhat being satisfied. And caregivers rated meeting their personal needs as less important, being less important compared to the individuals, and that meeting their personal needs on average was somewhat important and only a little bit satisfying. And we had one mother who has a son with a TBD, and she talked about how I think that people definitely talk about asking for help, and people talk about not wanting to be a burden. I think for me, it's sometimes not even knowing what I need. And we thought this one was pretty powerful and showing how high not only disease burden is, but caregiving burden can be, and that and caregivers were so attuned to their loved ones' needs, that this was also a really common sentiment expressed of how it took away, or they just didn't feel like they had the bandwidth or the space or the time to even consider their own needs. And so in summary, there's just a few points, and that what we have found for this, and that we need to consider unique needs beyond the biomedical domain. So not just how we medically may think about this, but psychosocially, how are people living with it, and how can we provide better care? Individuals and caregivers experience unmet needs in all 4 domains: psychosocial, medical, financial, and daily. And individuals and caregivers have distinct unmet needs across domains, where we saw how they experience similarities in emotional distress and accessing care, but some differences in personal finances and daily life needs. But that's it from me.